The leather-bound volume of Shakespeare's complete works had survived a steamboat fire, a stage coach robbery, and 3 months crossing the plains in a covered wagon. And Delilah Carter would be damned if she let anyone tell her reading was unsuitable for a woman working a cattle ranch in Georgetown, Colorado. She stood in the dusty yard of the Double H Ranch on a sweltering afternoon in July of 1876. Her burgundy skirts gathered in one hand, while the other held the precious book open to Twelfth Night. 7 cowhands sat scattered on fence rails and overturned crates, their faces ranging from curious to skeptical as she cleared her throat and began to read. If music be the food of love, play on. Give me excess of it, that surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die. The words rolled across the Colorado mountain air like honey, sweet and thick and unexpected. Most of the men had never heard Shakespeare spoken aloud, and certainly not by a 22-year-old woman with wheat-colored hair escaping from its pins and dust coating the hem of her dress. Delilah had arrived in Georgetown 3 weeks earlier, having inherited a quarter share of the ranch from an uncle she had barely known, a man who had struck silver in the nearby hills and bought cattle land before dying of pneumonia the previous winter. "What in the hell does that mean?" asked Buck Morrison, a grizzled hand who had been working cattle since before Delilah was born. "It means that sometimes wanting something too much can destroy the wanting itself," Delilah said, closing the book but keeping her finger tucked between the pages. "That excess ruins appetite." "Seems like a complicated way to say a man can get tired of beefsteak," Buck replied, and several of the other hands laughed. Delilah smiled despite herself. "Perhaps, but there is beauty in the complication, do not you think?" She had not expected anyone to answer, but a voice came from the barn entrance, low and measured. "I think there is truth in it, complicated or not, and truth told pretty is still truth." Delilah turned to see a man she had not met before, though she had been making a point of learning every person who worked the ranch. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that filled out his dusty work shirt and dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes were an unusual shade of green-gray, like sage after rain, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her heartbeat quicken. "You must be Frank Lawson," she said, remembering the name from the ledgers she had been studying in the ranch office. "The foreman told me you were up in the high pastures checking on the summer grazing." "Yes, madam." He removed his hat, revealing the line where sun-darkened skin met the paler shade of his forehead. "Got back about an hour ago. Heard someone reading and came to investigate." "And what do you think of Shakespeare being read to cowhands?" Delilah asked, lifting her chin slightly in anticipation of mockery. Frank stepped closer, his boots leaving prints in the dust. "I think any man who would not want to hear something beautiful is a fool. And I think a woman brave enough to read poetry to a bunch of rough hands has either great courage or great stubbornness." "Perhaps both," Delilah replied. "Perhaps." Frank's mouth quirked into something that was not quite a smile but held warmth nonetheless. "What else is in that book?" "Everything Shakespeare wrote. Sonnets, histories, comedies, tragedies. 37 plays and 154 sonnets. That ought to keep us occupied for a while then." Frank looked at the other hands, most of whom were watching this exchange with poorly concealed interest. "Any of you boys planning to finish mending that fence in the south pasture before sundown, or are you going to sit there catching flies?" The men scattered with muttered agreements, leaving Delilah standing alone with Frank in the yard. The afternoon sun blazed overhead, making the distant peaks shimmer with heat. Georgetown sat at nearly 9,000 feet, high enough that even summer could turn cold at night, but the July days baked the valley with relentless intensity. "I did not mean to interrupt their work," Delilah said. They were due for a break anyway. We have been working since before dawn. Frank tucked his hat under his arm. Your uncle was a good man, fair. The hands respected him. I wish I had known him better. Delilah ran her thumb along the spine of the book. My father and he had some falling out years ago. Family politics that no one ever properly explained to me. And now you have inherited a cattle ranch in the middle of Colorado territory. Frank's expression was unreadable. That must have come as a surprise. A shock, more like. I was teaching school in Boston when the lawyer's letter arrived. Delilah gestured toward the ranch house, a sturdy log structure with a wide porch. I had never been west of Philadelphia. What made you come instead of selling your share from back east? It was a fair question, one Delilah had asked herself during the long journey west. I suppose I wanted to see what my uncle had found out here that was worth leaving Boston for, and I had begun to feel that my life was too small, too prescribed. Reading about adventure is not the same as living it. No, madam, it is not. Frank settled his hat back on his head. Though I imagine you have discovered that adventure is often dirty, uncomfortable, and less romantic than books make it seem. I have calluses on my hands for the first time in my life, and I can barely walk after a day in the saddle, Delilah admitted. But I have also seen sunrises over mountains that made my heart ache with their beauty, and I have learned that I am stronger than I believed possible. Your uncle's partners, the Harrison brothers, they have been running things since he died. They are good ranchers, but they will test you. Frank's gaze was direct. They will want to see if you are serious about staying or if you will give up and go back east when the first snow flies. I am not going anywhere. Delilah spoke with more confidence than she felt. This is my inheritance and my responsibility. I mean to learn everything about running this ranch. Then you will need to understand more than bookkeeping and breeding lines. Frank nodded toward the book she still held. Though I would wager Shakespeare knew something about human nature that applies as much in a bunkhouse as in a palace. You have read Shakespeare. Delilah could not keep the surprise from her voice. My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father. She made sure all her children could read and write and appreciate good literature. A shadow crossed Frank's face. She died when I was 15. Cholera. After that, my father sort of gave up on civilized living. I have been working ranches and driving cattle ever since. I am sorry about your mother. Delilah knew the inadequacy of such words but offered them anyway. It was a long time ago. Frank changed the subject with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to deflecting sympathy. If you are planning to read to the hands regularly, you might want to pick something with more action. The histories might suit better than the comedies. You think they would prefer Henry V to Twelfth Night. I think men who spend their days in the saddle might appreciate a story about soldiers and battles more than romantic entanglements and mistaken identities. Frank's eyes held a glimmer of humor. Though I will admit, there is something to be said for romance. Before Delilah could respond, one of the Harrison brothers came striding across the yard. Thomas Harrison was the elder of the two, 40 years old with iron-gray hair and a permanently sunburned face. He had been civil to Delilah but not welcoming, making it clear he viewed her as an outsider who would be gone before the year was out. "Miss Carter," he said with a curt nod. "Frank, we need to talk about moving the herd down from the high country earlier than planned. There is mountain lion sign up there, and I do not want to risk losing cattle." "I will ride up tomorrow and take a look," Frank replied. "If there is a big cat hunting our stock, we will need to deal with it." "I will come with you," Delilah said impulsively. "I should know the grazing lands." Thomas's expression made his opinion clear. "The high country is no place for a woman, Miss Carter. The terrain is rough, and if there is a mountain lion around, it could be dangerous." I can ride and I can shoot, Delilah said, though her shooting was limited to tin cans in her uncle's yard under the patient instruction of one of the hands. And as a partner in this ranch, I should see all aspects of the operation. Miss Carter has a point, Frank said mildly. If she is going to be making decisions about the ranch, she needs to understand what she is deciding about. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue but finally gave a sharp nod. Fine. But you keep up and you do as Frank says. I will not have you getting hurt and blaming us for it. I will keep up, Delilah promised. Thomas stalked off and Frank turned to her with raised eyebrows. You do realize the high pastures are another 1,000 feet higher than we are here, and the ride is steep and rocky in places. Are you trying to talk me out of it? I am trying to make sure you know what you are agreeing to. Frank studied her face. But I suspect you are the kind of woman who does not back down from a challenge. My father used to say I was too stubborn for my own good. Delilah closed the Shakespeare volume carefully. What time should I be ready? We will leave at first light. Wear practical clothing and bring a coat. It will be cold up there even in summer. Frank started toward the barn, then paused and looked back. And Miss Carter, bring that book. If we are camping overnight, I would not mind hearing more Shakespeare before supper. Delilah felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Which play would you like to hear? Surprise me, Frank said, and this time his smile was full and genuine, transforming his serious face into something almost boyish. Delilah watched him disappear into the barn, then hurried toward the ranch house, her mind already planning what she would need for the trip. She had no proper riding clothes, nothing like the split skirts some frontier women wore, but she had a serviceable dark wool skirt that would not show every speck of dust and a sturdy shirtwaist. She would manage somehow. The ranch house was quiet in the afternoon heat. The other two inhabitants, a Chinese cook named Lee who had worked for her uncle for 5 years, and a housekeeper named Mrs. Brennan who came in 3 days a week from town, were both elsewhere. Delilah climbed the stairs to her room, a simple space with whitewashed walls and furniture her uncle had built himself. The window looked out over the valley, with Georgetown visible as a cluster of buildings a mile distant, and the mountains rising like walls on every side. She set the Shakespeare volume on the small table beside her bed, then began pulling out the clothes she would need. As she worked, her thoughts kept returning to Frank Lawson. There was something about him that was different from the other ranch hands, a quality of self-possession and intelligence that drew her. The fact that he appreciated Shakespeare made him unusual among the rough men who worked cattle for a living. Delilah had not come west looking for romance. She had come looking for purpose, for a life that was her own choosing rather than one prescribed by Boston society. But she could not deny the flutter in her stomach when Frank had asked her to read to him before supper. It had been a simple request, nothing more, yet it felt weighted with possibility. She slept poorly that night, excitement and nervousness warring within her. When the first gray light of dawn crept through her window, she was already awake and dressing. She braided her hair tightly and pinned it close to her head, then tucked the Shakespeare volume carefully into her saddlebag along with a canteen and the provisions Lee had prepared the night before. Frank was waiting in the yard when she emerged, holding the reins of 2 horses. One was the gentle mare Delilah had been learning to ride, a patient animal named Clover. The other was a rangy gelding with intelligent eyes and a nervous way of shifting its weight. "Morning," Frank greeted her. "You ready?" "As ready as I can be." Delilah took Clover's reins and managed to mount without assistance, though it was not graceful. Her muscles still protested after days of riding, but she was getting stronger. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The air was crisp and clean, scented with pine and sage. For the first hour, they followed a well-worn trail that climbed steadily through stands of aspen and spruce. Frank set a moderate pace, occasionally pointing out landmarks or explaining aspects of the ranch's operation. "Your uncle ran about 800 head of cattle," he said as they paused to let the horses drink from a stream. "The Harrison brothers want to expand that to over 1,000, but we would need more summer range. There is some Bureau of Land Management territory to the north that we could lease, but it would mean hiring more hands." "Is that a good investment?" Delilah asked, genuinely curious. "Depends on beef prices and whether we can get the cattle to market without losing too many to weather or predators or rustlers." Frank swung back into his saddle with easy grace. "Ranching is always a gamble. You bet against nature and hope you win more often than you lose." As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and Delilah found herself breathing harder. The trail narrowed in places, winding along rocky slopes where a misstep could send horse and rider tumbling. She focused on staying in the saddle and trusting Clover's sure-footedness, refusing to show the fear that occasionally spiked through her. By mid-morning they reached the high pasture, a broad meadow tucked between rocky peaks. Cattle grazed peacefully on the thick grass, their red hides vivid against the green. Frank dismounted and walked the perimeter, examining tracks and signs that Delilah could not read. She stayed on Clover, grateful for the chance to rest. "There has been a cat through here," Frank said when he returned. "Big one from the size of the tracks. Took down a calf about 3 days ago." He pointed to a rocky outcropping. "Dragged it up there to feed." "What do we do?" Delilah asked. "We moved the herd down earlier than planned. And we set up a watch tonight in case the cat comes back." Frank looked up at her. "I know Thomas said we might camp overnight, but if you would rather head back down, I can handle this alone." "I am staying," Delilah said firmly. "You might need help." Frank's expression was approving. "All right then. We will drive the cattle down to the lower pasture, then make camp and keep watch. If the cat shows up, we will try to scare it off. If that does not work, we may have to shoot it, though I would rather not. Mountain lions have as much right to be here as we do." They spent the afternoon moving cattle, and Delilah learned more about practical ranching in those hours than she had in all her studying of ledgers. The work was hot and dusty, requiring constant alertness as they pushed the reluctant animals down the narrow trail. By the time the last cow was in the lower pasture, the sun was sinking toward the western peaks, and Delilah was exhausted. Frank made camp in a sheltered spot near the tree line, building a small fire and setting coffee to boil. Delilah unsaddled Clover with clumsy fingers, her arms trembling with fatigue. She wanted to prove she could handle this life, but her body was making it clear she was still a novice. "Here," Frank said, appearing at her elbow with a cup of coffee. "You did good work today." "I feel like I have been trampled by those cattle," Delilah admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside. "You will toughen up. It takes time." Frank settled beside the fire, stretching his long legs out. "Your uncle went through the same thing when he first came out here. He was a businessman, not a rancher, but he learned, and he earned the respect of every hand who worked for him." Delilah sat down on a fallen log, feeling the day's exertion in every muscle. The sky was deepening to purple and the first stars were appearing. The temperature had dropped sharply, and she pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Did you bring that book?" Frank asked. Delilah had almost forgotten. She retrieved the Shakespeare volume from her saddlebag and brought it to the fire. "What would you like to hear? You choose," Frank said. "Something that fits this place." Delilah thought for a moment, then opened to the tempest. "This is about magic and exile and finding redemption in wild places," she said. "It seems appropriate." She began to read, her voice carrying across the mountain meadow. The words wove a spell in the gathering darkness, and Frank listened with complete attention. She read until the light was too dim to make out the words, then closed the book reluctantly. "That is beautiful," Frank said quietly. "The way Shakespeare puts words together, it is like music." "That is exactly what it is," Delilah agreed. "Language used not just to convey meaning but to create beauty." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the distant sounds of the night. An owl called from the trees, and somewhere far off a coyote howled. Delilah had never felt so far from Boston, from everything familiar, yet she did not feel lost. Sitting here beside Frank under the vast western sky, she felt found. "Why did you really come west?" Frank asked. "The truth, not the polite answer you gave before." Delilah considered her response carefully. "Because I was 22 years old and my life already felt finished. There was a man my father wanted me to marry, a banker's son with good prospects and no imagination. We would have had a comfortable life, predictable and safe and utterly without passion. When the letter came about my uncle's death and the inheritance, it felt like a door opening, a chance to become someone other than the person Boston expected me to be." "And who do you want to be?" "I am still figuring that out." Delilah looked at him across the fire. "What about you? You could be anything with your education and abilities. Why work cattle in the middle of Colorado? Because I am good at it. And because after my mother died, I needed to be someplace big enough to contain grief that size. The West is big enough for anything." Frank poked at the fire with a stick. "I tried going back east once, about 5 years ago, thought I might make something more of myself. Spent 6 months in Chicago working in a stockyard office. Nearly went mad from being inside all day, from the noise and the crowds and the feeling of walls closing in." "So you came back to the mountains." "I came home," Frank corrected. "This is where I belong, for better or worse." They talked late into the night, conversation ranging from books to philosophy to the practical realities of surviving in a harsh land. Delilah learned that Frank had a younger sister in Denver who was studying to be a nurse, and a brother who had gone to California to seek his fortune in what was left of the gold fields. She told him about growing up in Boston, about her mother who had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Delilah was 10, about her father's slow retreat into bitterness after that loss. When they finally settled into sleep, Frank took first watch while Delilah wrapped herself in blankets near the fire. She was sure she was too keyed up to rest, but exhaustion claimed her within minutes. She woke to Frank's hand on her shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "Do not move fast, but look toward the rocks." Delilah's heart hammered as she slowly turned her head. In the pale moonlight, she could see the mountain lion, a massive tawny shape perched on the outcropping about 50 yards away. Its eyes reflected green in the firelight as it watched them with predatory interest. "I am going to fire a shot over its head," Frank whispered. "Hopefully that will scare it off." He raised his rifle carefully and fired. The explosion shattered the night silence and the mountain lion sprang away, disappearing into the darkness with liquid grace. Frank kept the rifle ready, watching the shadows, but the cat did not return. "You can breathe now," he said after several minutes had passed. Delilah realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily. That was terrifying. That was nature. The cat was just being a cat looking for an easy meal. Frank lowered the rifle. "But we sent a clear message that we are not easy, it will hunt elsewhere." They kept the fire built up for the rest of the night, taking turns on watch. When dawn finally came, Delilah felt gritty-eyed and jittery from lack of sleep, but also exhilarated. She had faced actual danger and not fallen apart. She had spent a night in the high country and survived. The ride back down the mountain was easier than the climb up had been. Frank seemed pleased with how the cattle had been moved, and he chatted amiably about the ranch's operations. By the time they reached the ranch yard in the early afternoon, Delilah felt she had passed some kind of test. Thomas Harrison was waiting for them, his expression sour. "You found Cat's sign, Big Tom," Frank confirmed, swinging down from his horse. "We moved the herd down and discouraged the cat from coming around. Should not be a problem anymore. And Miss Carter managed not to get herself killed." Thomas's tone was dismissive. "Miss Carter worked as hard as any hand I have ridden with," Frank said, an edge in his voice. "She has earned your respect, Thomas, whether you are inclined to give it or not." Thomas's eyes narrowed, but he nodded grudgingly. "Well enough. At least she is not completely useless." He stalked off before Delilah could formulate a response. "Do not mind him," Frank said. "He resents anyone connected to your uncle because your uncle owned a larger share of the ranch than the Harrisons do. It is not personal." "It feels personal," Delilah muttered. "Give it time. You will win him over." Frank unsaddled his horse with practiced efficiency. "Now go inside and get some rest. You have earned it." Delilah wanted to stay and talk more, but her body was demanding sleep. She made her way to the house, where Lee clucked over her disheveled appearance and insisted she eat something before resting. She managed a bowl of stew before climbing the stairs to her room and collapsing fully clothed on the bed. She slept through the afternoon and woke in the early evening to find her muscles had stiffened into painful knots. Moving carefully, she washed and changed into a clean dress, then made her way downstairs. Voices drifted from the parlor, and she found Frank sitting with Samuel Harrison, Thomas's younger brother. Samuel was 35, shorter and stockier than Thomas, with a more easygoing temperament. He smiled when he saw Delilah. "Frank has been telling me about your adventure in the high country. Sounds like you handled yourself well." "I managed not to embarrass myself too badly," Delilah said, settling carefully into a chair. "That is more than most greenhorns can say." Samuel leaned back, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "We have been discussing the fall roundup. It is still 2 months off, but we need to start planning. Frank thinks we should hire 4 extra hands for the drive to Denver." "Will the profits justify the additional expense?" Delilah asked. Both men looked mildly surprised that she had asked a business question. Samuel recovered first. "If we can get 800 head to market in good condition, yes. The problem is always getting them there. We could lose 50 head or more to accidents, illness, or rustlers." "What if we sold locally instead?" Delilah suggested. "Georgetown is growing because of the silver mines." "Surely there is a market for beef right here." "There is," Frank acknowledged, "but the prices are not as good as what we can get in Denver, even accounting for the cost of the drive." They talked business for an hour, and Delilah found herself genuinely interested. This was so different from the genteel world of Boston social calls and needlework. Here, her opinions were being solicited and considered. She was being treated as a partner in a real enterprise. Over the following weeks, Delilah settled into the rhythm of ranch life. She spent mornings working with the account books, learning to track expenses and income. Afternoons, she devoted to riding and improving her horsemanship. And most evenings, she read Shakespeare to whichever hands were interested in listening. It became a routine that the men looked forward to. Even the most skeptical cowboys would drift over when Delilah brought out her book, settling on the porch steps or leaning against the corral fence to listen. She worked her way through the histories, just as Frank had suggested, and the stories of kings and battles resonated with men who understood hardship and conflict. Frank was her most faithful audience. No matter how tired he was from the day's work, he would make time to listen. Often he would ask Delilah to read one more scene, just one more passage before supper. His request became a running joke among the other hands, but it was said with affection rather than mockery. "That cowboy has got it bad for you," Lee observed one evening as he kneaded bread dough in the kitchen. "He looks at you like you are the sunrise." "We are friends," Delilah protested, though her cheeks warmed. "We both appreciate literature." Lee's knowing smile suggested he did not believe that was all there was to it, but he did not press the matter. Delilah told herself Lee was reading too much into a simple friendship. But she could not deny that her heart lifted when she saw Frank, or that she found herself looking for excuses to work alongside him. When he offered to teach her to rope cattle, she accepted eagerly, despite having no particular interest in roping. When he asked if she wanted to ride out to inspect fence lines, she went without hesitation. They were careful not to be alone together more than propriety allowed. There were always other hands nearby, always work to justify their time together. But the connection between them deepened with each conversation, each shared glance. In late August, a letter arrived for Frank. Delilah saw him reading it outside the bunkhouse, his expression troubled. That evening, when she read from Henry Roman IV, he was distracted and left before she finished the scene. She found him the next morning working alone in the barn, mending tack with fierce concentration. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Frank looked up and she saw genuine distress in his eyes. "My sister wrote, 'My father is sick, consumption. She thinks I should come to Denver to see him before the end. Of course you must go.'" Delilah moved closer. "How long has it been since you saw him?" 8 years. We had a falling out after my mother died. He blamed me for not being there when she got sick." Frank's jaw tightened. "I was working a cattle drive in Wyoming. By the time I got word and made it home, she had been dead for a week. That was not your fault, I know, but he needed someone to blame and I was convenient." Frank set down the bridle he had been working on. "I have been sending money to support him, but I have not gone to see him. Pride, I suppose, stubbornness. Now I am running out of time to make it right. When will you leave?" "Tomorrow, if I can arrange it." "The fall roundup is still weeks away and the other hands can manage the daily work." Frank hesitated. "I do not know how long I will be gone." "Take as long as you need," Delilah said. "Family is important." She helped him prepare for the journey, packing provisions and making sure he had enough money for the stage fare to Denver. The ranch felt empty after he left, though the work continued as always. Delilah found herself looking up expecting to see him, listening for his voice. The evening Shakespeare readings continued, but without Frank there to request one more scene, they felt incomplete. 2 weeks passed with no word. Delilah threw herself into learning every aspect of the ranch operation, working alongside the hands until her muscles ached and her hands were rough with calluses. Thomas Harrison seemed to soften slightly toward her, acknowledging her dedication if not quite accepting her as an equal partner. In mid-September, as the aspen trees began to turn gold on the mountainsides, Frank returned. Delilah was working in the ranch office when she heard horses in the yard. She looked out the window and saw him dismounting, his movements weary but purposeful. She met him on the porch, trying to read his expression. "How is your father?" "He died 3 days after I arrived." Frank removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "But we had time to talk, to make peace with each other. He told me my mother would have been proud of the man I became, and that he was sorry for the years we lost to anger." "I am glad you had that time with him," Delilah said gently. "So am I." Frank looked at her directly. Being in Denver, settling his affairs, spending time with my sister and her family, it made me realize something. Life is too short to let opportunities pass because of fear or propriety or worrying about what other people think. Delilah's heart began to beat faster. What are you saying? I am saying that I have been trying to keep my distance from you because you are part owner of this ranch and I work for you. Because you are educated and cultured and I am just a cowhand. Because you come from a world that is nothing like mine. Frank stepped closer. But none of that matters as much as the simple fact that I have come to care for you deeply, and I think you might feel the same way. I do, Delilah whispered. I have been trying to hide it to be sensible, but I do. Frank reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. Then maybe we should stop trying to be sensible and just see where this leads us. People will talk, Delilah said, but she did not pull her hand away. People always talk. Let them. Frank's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. I am not asking you to marry me today or even make any promises. I am just asking permission to court you properly, to see if what we both feel is real and lasting. You have my permission, Delilah said, and the smile that broke across her face felt like sunrise. Though I suspect you are about to cause quite a scandal among the hands. I suspect they already know. Frank's grin was boyish. Lee told me just now that if I did not tell you how I felt, he was going to do it for me. They stood on the porch holding hands, grinning at each other like fools, until Samuel Harrison rode into the yard and pulled up short at the sight of them. Well, Samuel said, swinging down from his horse with an amused expression. I suppose this was inevitable. Thomas is going to have an apoplexy. Thomas will survive, Frank said mildly. Samuel laughed. True enough. Congratulations to you both. For what it is worth, I think you are well matched. He headed into the house, still chuckling. Frank turned back to Delilah. I should get cleaned up and report on the work that needs doing. But tonight, after supper, will you read to me? Something romantic this time, not battles and history. I think I can arrange that, Delilah said softly. That evening, the ranch hands gathered as usual for the reading, but there was a different quality to their attention. Word had clearly spread about Frank and Delilah's understanding, and the men watched the two of them with knowing smiles and occasional elbows to ribs. Delilah opened the book to Romeo and Juliet and began to read. The familiar words took on new resonance as she spoke of love at first sight and passion that defied family opposition. When she reached the balcony scene, her eyes kept drifting to Frank, who watched her with such open admiration that she stumbled over the words. Read me another one before supper, Frank said when she paused, and the other hands laughed at the familiar refrain. Which one? Delilah asked. The sonnets. Read one of the sonnets. She paged through to find her favorite, Sonnet 116. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Her voice wavered on the last lines, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. When she looked up, Frank was standing, crossing the space between them. In front of everyone, he took her hand and raised it to his lips. That is what I feel for you, he said quietly. An ever-fixed mark, a star for a wandering bark. Buck Morrison cleared his throat loudly. All right, you two are making the rest of us feel like we ought to be somewhere else. How about we give you some privacy? The hands scattered with good-natured grumbling, leaving Frank and Delilah alone in the gathering dusk. She set the book aside and stood, moving into his arms as naturally as breathing. He held her carefully, as if she were something precious and fragile. I have wanted to do this since the day you read Shakespeare to us in the yard, he murmured against her hair. You stood there covered in dust, quoting poetry to a bunch of rough men, and I thought I had never seen anyone braver or more beautiful. I thought you were going to mock me like the others, Delilah admitted. Never. I saw someone who refused to let the world make her smaller than she was meant to be. How could I mock that? Frank pulled back enough to look at her face. You fit here, Delilah. You belong in this wild place. I am beginning to believe that, she said. Though I suspect I will always be a bit of an odd duck, reading poetry to cowboys. The best kind of odd duck. Frank smiled. The kind that makes life interesting. They stood together as the stars emerged overhead, talking about everything and nothing. Frank told her about his childhood in these mountains, about learning to ride before he could read, about his mother's determination that her children would have education and opportunity. Delilah shared memories of Boston that she had never spoken aloud before, the loneliness of being different in a world that valued conformity, the hunger for something more than what was offered. I used to read Shakespeare and dream of adventure, she said. Love that was passionate and all-consuming, but I thought those were just stories, fantasies that had nothing to do with real life. And now I think maybe Shakespeare understood something true, that love can be extraordinary if we are brave enough to reach for it. She looked up at him. I am ready to be brave. Frank kissed her then, gentle and sweet, his hands cradling her face. It was nothing like the restrained, polite kisses she had received from the banker's son in Boston. This kiss promised passion and partnership, adventure and home all wrapped together. When they finally drew apart, Delilah was breathless and laughing. We should probably go in before we scandalize everyone completely. Probably, Frank agreed, but he made no move to release her. They stayed on the porch until the dinner bell rang, reluctant to end the moment. Inside, Lee had prepared a feast, and the hands welcomed Frank back with loud enthusiasm. The evening had a celebratory feel, though no one mentioned what they were celebrating. It was understood that something significant had shifted, that the ranch had witnessed the beginning of a love story. The fall roundup began 3 weeks later. It was a massive undertaking, gathering scattered cattle from across thousands of acres of range. Delilah insisted on participating, and though Thomas Harrison grumbled, he did not forbid it. She rode out with the hands each morning, learning to work as part of a team, to anticipate the movement of cattle, and cut out individual animals for inspection. The work was exhausting and often frustrating. Cattle were contrary creatures with minds of their own, and the mountain terrain made every task harder. But Delilah loved it. She loved the challenge, the physicality, the sense of accomplishment when a particularly difficult cow was finally brought into the herd. Frank worked nearby whenever possible, though his responsibilities as foreman meant he could not always stay close. Still, Delilah would catch his eye across a meadow full of milling cattle and feel her heart lift. They snatched moments together whenever they could, brief conversations during water breaks, shared meals around the campfire at night. One evening during the roundup, after a particularly grueling day, Delilah sat by the fire too tired to move. Frank brought her coffee and settled beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. You know, he said quietly, when this is all done and the cattle are driven to market, I am going to have a question to ask you. What kind of question? Delilah asked, though her racing heart suggested she already knew. The kind that requires a ring and a bent knee and a lot of hope that you will say yes. Frank looked at her, firelight dancing in his eyes. But I wanted to give you warning. In case you need time to think about what it would mean to tie your life to mine. I have been thinking about it since the day we rode up to the high country together, Delilah said. Actually, if I am being honest, I have been thinking about it since I saw you standing in the barn doorway talking about truth told pretty. Is that a yes? That is a very strong maybe heading toward yes. Delilah smiled. But you should probably ask me properly before I give you a definite answer. Fair enough. Frank kissed her temple. Though I am fairly confident I know what your answer will be. Confident, are you? You are reading me Shakespeare every night. You rode up into mountain lion country without complaint. You work cattle in the rain and dust and never ask for special treatment. Frank's voice was warm with affection. Yes, I am confident, because I know you would not be here doing any of this if you did not love this place and this life. And I am part of both. Arrogant cowboy, Delilah murmured, but she was smiling as she leaned against his shoulder. The roundup concluded successfully, with the cattle counted and sorted for the drive to Denver. Frank would lead the drive with 6 hands, a journey that would take nearly 2 weeks. Thomas and Samuel would stay to manage the ranch, and Delilah would remain behind as well, much to her disappointment. I need you here, Frank explained. The Harrison brothers respect you now, but they still see this as their ranch. Having you here as a visible presence, making decisions and handling problems, that is important. We are partners in this venture, and partners need to trust each other to handle things independently. I know you are right, Delilah said, but I will miss you terribly. I will miss you too. But I will come back with good news about cattle sales and a ring in my pocket. Frank pulled her close. And then we can start planning our future properly. The day the cattle drive left was blustery and cold, a preview of the winter to come. Delilah watched from the porch as Frank and the other hands moved 800 head of cattle out of the holding pens and onto the road that would take them to Denver. Frank raised his hand in farewell, and she waved back, blinking against tears she told herself were from the wind. The ranch felt empty with half the hands gone. Delilah threw herself into work, tackling projects that had been postponed during the busy summer. She helped Lee preserve the last of the garden vegetables, reorganized the ranch office until every document was properly filed, and worked with Samuel to plan improvements for the following year. In the evenings, she read Shakespeare aloud to the remaining hands, though the audience was smaller and the readings felt incomplete without Frank there to request one more scene. She worked her way through As You Like It, finding unexpected resonance in Rosalind's journey from court to forest, from constrained life to authentic freedom. 10 days after the drive departed, Thomas Harrison approached her in the ranch yard. I owe you an apology, he said without preamble. I have been treating you like an unwelcome intruder when you are a legitimate partner in this enterprise. You have proven yourself more than capable, and I have been too stubborn to acknowledge it. Thank you, Delilah said, genuinely moved. That means a great deal coming from you. Your uncle would be proud of how you have taken to this life. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to expressing emotion. And Frank is a good man. You have chosen well. He has not actually proposed yet, Delilah pointed out. He will. Thomas almost smiled. And you will say yes, and we will have a wedding to plan. Just do me a favor and wait until after spring calving. We cannot spare either of you during that chaos. Delilah laughed. I will keep that in mind. 3 days later, a rider came from Georgetown with news that made Delilah's blood run cold. There had been an early blizzard in the mountains between the ranch and Denver. Several cattle operations had lost animals, and some hands had not reported in. No one had heard from Frank's drive in 4 days. It is probably nothing, Samuel said, trying to sound reassuring. Frank knows those trails better than anyone. He would have found shelter and waited out the storm. But Delilah saw the worry in his eyes. She spent a sleepless night pacing her room, running through terrible scenarios. By morning she had made a decision. "I am riding to Denver," she announced at breakfast. "Absolutely not," Thomas said immediately. "The trails are dangerous after a storm. You could get lost or hurt." "Then come with me." Delilah looked between the Harrison brothers. "Frank could be in trouble. Those men could need help. We cannot just sit here doing nothing." Thomas and Samuel exchanged glances. Finally, Samuel nodded. "She is right. We should go." They left within the hour, Delilah and both Harrison brothers, riding hard for the Denver road. The first day they made good progress, following trails that were muddy but passable. They camped that night in a canyon, building a large fire against the cold. The second day they found the first signs of trouble. A lined shack that cattle drives normally used for shelter had been damaged by the storm, its roof partially collapsed. But there was no sign of Frank's outfit. They pushed on, scanning the landscape for any indication of where the drive might have taken refuge. Late in the afternoon, they spotted buzzards circling ahead. Delilah's stomach clenched, but she forced herself to ride toward them. They found dead cattle, about 20 head that had been caught in the open by the storm and frozen, but no sign of the drovers. "This is bad," Thomas said, examining the carcasses. "These are our brand, but where are the men and the rest of the herd?" They found the answer an hour later. A protected valley with good grass and water, a natural shelter where Frank had pushed the remaining cattle. And there, tending to the herd, were all 6 men who had left with the drive. Delilah nearly fell from her horse in her rush to reach Frank. He caught her, holding her tight while she struggled between tears of relief and anger at being so frightened. "We are fine," he said, stroking her hair. "The storm hit hard and fast. We lost some cattle, but all the men made it through. I sent a rider to Georgetown yesterday to let people know we were all right. He must have missed you on the trail." "I thought you were dead," Delilah said against his chest. "I thought I had lost you before I even had the chance to say yes." "Yes to what?" Frank pulled back to look at her face. "To whatever question you were planning to ask me when you got back." Delilah managed a watery smile. "The one involving a ring and a bent knee and hope. That is supposed to wait until I have the ring." Frank glanced at the Harrison brothers, who were diplomatically pretending great interest in the cattle. "But since you have ridden all this way and terrified yourself worrying, maybe now is as good a time as any." He dropped to one knee in the mud and grass, still holding her hand. "Delilah Carter, I do not have a ring yet, and this is not the romantic proposal I planned. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You are brave and smart and stubborn, and you read Shakespeare to cowboys like it is the most natural thing in the world. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Delilah said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely yes." Frank stood and kissed her thoroughly to the cheers of the watching hands. Even Thomas Harrison was smiling, and Samuel let out a whoop that echoed across the valley. They drove the remaining cattle on to Denver together, all of them working as a team. Despite the losses to the storm, the sale went well. Beef prices were high, and the cattle were in good condition. Frank negotiated shrewdly, getting top dollar for the herd. On their last evening in Denver, Frank took Delilah to a jeweler and let her choose a ring. She selected a simple gold band with a small sapphire, practical and beautiful. It fit perfectly on her finger, and she kept looking at it in wonder as they walked back to their hotel. "When should we marry?" Frank asked as they stood on the hotel porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "Thomas suggested we wait until after spring calving," Delilah said. "But I do not want to wait that long. What about Christmas? That gives us 2 months to prepare." "Christmas sounds perfect." Frank wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his solid warmth. We could have a small ceremony at the ranch, just family and the hands who work for us. That is all I want." Delilah turned in his arms to face him. "I am not the girl who left Boston anymore. I do not need a fancy society wedding. I just need you and the people who matter to us." They returned to the ranch to find preparations already underway. Lee had appointed himself in charge of planning the wedding feast, and he had elaborate ideas involving 3 kinds of meat and 5 different pies. Mrs. Brennan had connections to a seamstress in Georgetown who could make a proper wedding dress. The hands were planning to decorate the barn for a dance after the ceremony. Delilah felt swept up in the enthusiasm, touched by how thoroughly she had been accepted into this community. She worked on her vows in the evenings, trying to find words adequate to express what she felt. Shakespeare had covered every aspect of love in his plays and sonnets, but none of it seemed quite right for what she wanted to say to Frank. In the end, she decided to write her own words, drawing inspiration from Shakespeare but making them her own. She practiced in her room, speaking aloud to her reflection in the mirror, trying to get the tone right. Winter came early to the high country. By late November, snow blanketed the valley and the temperature rarely climbed above freezing. The ranch work shifted to winter rhythms, feeding cattle hay and breaking ice on water troughs. The days were short, darkness falling by late afternoon. But inside the ranch house, there was warmth and light. Delilah and Frank spent their evenings together, planning their future. They talked about where they would live after the marriage, finally deciding to build a small house on the ranch property, something that would be truly theirs. They discussed the possibility of expanding the herd, of buying more land, of building something lasting. "I want children," Frank said one night as they sat before the fire. 2 or 3 at least. I want them to grow up here to know this life." "I want that too," Delilah agreed, "though I also want to make sure any daughters we have receive a proper education. And any sons should learn to appreciate Shakespeare. We will raise them to value both strength and beauty, practicality and poetry." Frank pulled her close. "We will give them the best of both our worlds." Christmas approached with gathering excitement. The ranch hands cut a tall pine tree and set it up in the parlor. Delilah and Mrs. Brennan decorated it with strings of popcorn and paper stars. Lee outdid himself preparing for the feast, enlisting every available person to help with the cooking. Delilah's wedding dress was delivered a week before Christmas. A simple but elegant gown of cream-colored wool with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. It was nothing like the elaborate confections she would have worn for a Boston society wedding, but it suited her perfectly. Frank's sister arrived 3 days before the wedding, traveling from Denver with her husband and 2 small children. Sarah Lawson Reed was a younger, feminine version of Frank, with the same gray-green eyes and quick intelligence. She embraced Delilah warmly. "I am so glad Frank found you," she said. "After our father died, I worried he would stay alone in these mountains forever, too stubborn to admit he needed someone." "He is stubborn," Delilah agreed, "but so am I. We are well matched that way." Christmas Eve dawned clear and bitterly cold, the sky a brilliant blue above the snow-covered peaks. The barn had been transformed with pine boughs and candles, and a fire roared in a hastily constructed stone pit to take the edge off the chill. Delilah dressed in her room with Sarah's help, her hands shaking slightly as she fastened the buttons. "I am not nervous about marrying him," she explained. "I am nervous about everyone watching me make my vows." "Just look at Frank," Sarah advised. "Forget everyone else is there and speak to him alone." The ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, timed so the sun would paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold. Delilah waited in the ranch house while the guests assembled, hearing the murmur of voices and occasional laughter from the barn. When it was time, Thomas Harrison came to escort her. "Your uncle would have been proud to do this," he said gruffly. "Since he cannot, I hope you will allow me the honor." "Thank you," Delilah said, touched, "for everything, for giving me a chance when you did not think I belonged here." "You proved me wrong about a lot of things," Thomas said. "Now, let us get you married before Frank wears a hole in the barn floor from pacing." They walked across the snowy yard to the barn, and when the doors opened, Delilah saw the full effect of the decorations. Candles glowed everywhere, and the pine boughs filled the air with their fresh scent. The ranch hands stood in their Sunday best, smiling broadly. And at the front, beside a minister who had ridden up from Georgetown, stood Frank. He wore a new suit, dark and well-tailored, but it was his expression that made Delilah's breath catch. He looked at her as if she were the answer to every question he had ever asked, the solution to every problem. As if she were everything. She walked toward him, her hand on Thomas's arm, and the words she had practiced fled her mind. It did not matter. She reached Frank's side, and he took her hand, and the minister began to speak. The ceremony was simple and brief. When it came time for vows, Delilah spoke from her heart. "I came west looking for adventure and found a home. I came looking for purpose and found partnership. I came looking for a bigger life and found love that made the whole world feel infinite. Frank, you are my ever-fixed mark, my star for every wandering bark. I promise to love you with strength and gentleness, with passion and patience, all the days of my life." Frank's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke his own vows. "Delilah, you walked into my life reading Shakespeare to cowboys and made me believe in poetry again. You are brave and brilliant, and you belong to these mountains as much as any creature born here. I promise to honor your intelligence, support your dreams, and read with you every evening before supper for as long as we both shall live. I will love you fiercely and tenderly, today and always." The minister pronounced them married, and Frank kissed her to enthusiastic applause from the assembled guests. Then the celebration began in earnest. Lee had prepared a feast that groaned the tables, and someone produced a fiddle for dancing. The barn rang with music and laughter late into the night. Delilah danced with Frank, with both Harrison brothers, with each of the ranch hands. Her feet ached and her face hurt from smiling, but she could not remember ever being happier. This was her family now, these rough, kind men who had accepted her completely. This was her home, these mountains and valleys. This was her future, building a life with the man she loved. Near midnight, she and Frank slipped away to the small cabin the hands had prepared for them, a temporary home until their house was built in the spring. A fire crackled in the hearth, and someone had left fresh flowers despite the winter cold. Frank closed the door behind them, and suddenly they were alone together for the first time as husband and wife. He pulled her close, and she went willingly into his arms. "Hello, Mrs. Lawson," he murmured. "Hello, Mr. Lawson," she replied. And then there were no more words, only the eloquence of touch and breath and whispered endearments. The winter passed in a cocoon of happiness. Delilah and Frank settled into married life with surprising ease, their days filled with work, and their evenings with conversation and reading. True to his vow, Frank requested Shakespeare before supper nearly every night, and Delilah happily obliged. They began planning their house in detail, sketching layouts by the fire and debating the merits of various designs. Frank wanted a large kitchen because he knew Delilah enjoyed cooking. Delilah insisted on a library, a room dedicated to books and reading. They compromised and adjusted until they had plans for a home that would suit them both perfectly. In March, as the snow began to melt, and the first green appeared on the south-facing slopes. Construction began. The Harrison brothers donated timber from the ranch's own forest, and every hand contributed labor. The house took shape quickly, a sturdy log structure with wide windows to capture the mountain views. By May, it was finished. Delilah walked through the rooms with wonder, touching the smooth wood of the mantel Frank had carved himself, running her fingers along the shelves he had built for her books. The library had a large window facing east, perfect for morning reading. The kitchen had a modern stove that Lee had insisted they order from Denver. "It is perfect," she said, turning to find Frank watching her from the doorway. "It is ours," he corrected. "Our home, our future." They moved in on a warm spring day, carrying their few possessions from the cabin. That night, they christened every room, laughing and loving and planning all the memories they would make within these walls. Summer brought its usual rhythm of work. Delilah had become as competent a ranch hand as any of the men, able to rope cattle and mend fence, and sit a saddle for 12 hours without complaint. But she noticed changes in her body, a persistent fatigue and queasiness that grew worse as the weeks passed. Sarah, visiting for a week in June, took one look at her and smiled knowingly. "You are pregnant." "I suspected," Delilah admitted, "but I was not certain." "Have you told Frank?" "Not yet. I wanted to be sure." Delilah pressed a hand to her still flat stomach. "What if something goes wrong?" "My mother died in childbirth. That was tragic, but it does not mean the same will happen to you." Sarah squeezed her hand. "You are strong and healthy, and Frank will be beside himself with joy." Delilah told Frank that evening after they had finished their nightly Shakespeare reading. She simply took his hand and placed it on her stomach and said, "We are going to have a baby." The expression on his face cycled through shock, wonder, and pure elation in the space of seconds. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be." "By my calculation, the baby should arrive in late January or early February." Frank pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of glass. "I am going to be a father. We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Delilah asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy does not begin to cover it." Frank kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You have given me everything, Delilah. A home, a purpose, love, and now a child. How did I get so fortunate?" "I ask myself the same question every day," she said softly. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and fall. Delilah continued working as long as she was able, though Frank and the other hands insisted she avoid the most strenuous tasks. She spent more time in the ranch office, managing the business side of the operation while Frank handled the physical labor. In November, Sarah came to stay, bringing her nursing knowledge and calm competence. She and Delilah prepared everything that would be needed for the birth, gathering supplies and making the bedroom as comfortable as possible. Winter settled over the valley again, and Delilah grew large and ungainly. She could no longer ride, could barely walk without waddling. But Frank treated her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world, reading to her when she was too tired to hold a book, rubbing her aching back, bringing her endless cups of tea. On a bitter cold night in late January, the pains began. Sarah sent Frank to fetch the doctor from Georgetown, though the roads were treacherous with ice. The doctor arrived within 2 hours, a gruff man who had delivered half the babies in the valley. The labor was long and difficult. Delilah had never known such pain, waves of it that seemed endless. She clung to Sarah's hand and tried to remember to breathe. Frank waited downstairs, pacing the length of the house over and over. Dawn was breaking when the baby finally came, a lusty cry filling the bedroom. "A boy," the doctor announced, "healthy and strong." Sarah cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft blankets before placing him in Delilah's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, the dark hair and unfocused eyes, and felt her heart expand impossibly. "He is perfect," Frank was allowed in moments later. He approached the bed cautiously as if afraid he might break something, but when he saw the baby, his entire face transformed with wonder. "Our son," he whispered. "What should we name him?" Delilah asked. They had discussed names for months without reaching a decision. But now, looking at their son, Frank said, "William, after Shakespeare, because his mother's love of poetry brought us together." "William Frank Lawson," Delilah said, testing the name. "I like it." William was a demanding baby, crying often and sleeping poorly. But he was also perfect in every way, with his father's eyes and his mother's determined chin. Delilah and Frank took turns walking him through the night, singing lullabies and reading Shakespeare in quiet voices. As winter gave way to spring, William began to settle into a routine. Delilah found she could manage motherhood and her ranch responsibilities, though she was constantly exhausted. Frank was a devoted father, changing nappies and bathing the baby with the same competence he brought to working cattle. "You are good at this," Delilah observed one evening, watching him settle William for sleep. "I like it," Frank said. "Being a father, I had worried I would not know how, that I would make the same mistakes my father made, but it feels natural." "You are nothing like your father," Delilah assured him. "You are patient and gentle and present. William is fortunate to have you." The years passed in a blur of work and joy. William grew into a sturdy toddler, then a bright, curious boy. When he was 3, Delilah discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and their daughter Alice was born on a warm September evening, arriving so quickly the doctor barely made it in time. 2 years after that came another son, Thomas, named for Thomas Harrison, who had died the previous winter, having finally accepted Delilah completely as a partner and friend. And 3 years after Thomas came little Sarah, named for Frank's sister. The house that had seemed so spacious was now filled with the noise and chaos of 4 children. Books were scattered across every surface because Delilah read to the children constantly, instilling in them her love of literature. The older children helped with age-appropriate ranch chores, learning the value of hard work and responsibility. On summer evenings, the family would gather on the porch, and Delilah would read Shakespeare aloud while the children played, and Frank listened with the same rapt attention he had shown years ago. William, now 10, had inherited his mother's love of words and could recite whole passages from memory. Alice was more practical-minded, preferring to help her father with the horses. Thomas was quiet and thoughtful, always observing. And Sarah, at 3, was pure mischief and sunshine. The ranch prospered under their management. The Harrison brothers had sold their shares to Frank and Delilah years earlier, retiring to Denver to enjoy their later years. New hands came and went, but a core group remained, men who had become like family. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Frank gave Delilah a complete set of Shakespeare's works, beautifully bound in leather with her name embossed in gold. "To replace the one that is falling apart from being read so often," he said. "I love the old one because it has survived everything with me," Delilah said, running her hand over the worn cover of her original volume. "But I love this too. We can start reading from it tonight." That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat together in the library. Delilah opened the new book to A Midsummer Night's Dream and began to read. Frank listened, his hand holding hers, and when she paused, he said the words that had become their tradition, "Read me another one before supper." "We have already had supper," Delilah pointed out, smiling. "Then read me another one before bed, Before tomorrow, before the next hour passes. Frank pulled her close. Just read me another one, my love. I never tire of hearing your voice make Shakespeare's words come alive. So she read on into the night, the same way she had been reading to him for 15 years, the same way she would read to him for the rest of their lives. Outside, the Colorado mountains stood eternal and unchanging. Inside, a woman who had come west looking for adventure had found something infinitely better. A love that was ever fixed, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams, and a family that was her greatest joy. Years continued to pass, each bringing its own challenges and triumphs. William went to college in Denver, studying literature and law, but always returned to the ranch for summers and holidays. Alice married a neighboring rancher's son, a good man who appreciated her strength and independence. Thomas took over more of the ranch operations, showing a natural talent for breeding and animal husbandry. And Sarah, wild and free, announced at 16 that she wanted to be a veterinarian, shocking everyone but surprising no one. Delilah's hair turned silver, and Frank's moved from dark to gray. Their hands grew more calloused, and their backs sometimes ached, but their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something richer and more complex than the passionate beginnings. They added rooms to the house as the family grew, building on space for visiting grandchildren. William had 3 children, Alice 4, Thomas 2, and Sarah declared she was too busy with her veterinary practice to think about marriage, though Delilah suspected that would change eventually. On their 30th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Children ran shrieking through the yard while adults reminisced and laughed. Lee, now in his 80s but still cooking, prepared an elaborate feast. The barn was decorated again, just as it had been for the wedding. That evening, Delilah and Frank stood on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the mountains. "Do you ever regret coming west?" Frank asked. "Not for a single moment," Delilah said. "Boston feels like a different lifetime, like it happened to a different person." "Because it did, in a way. You are not that woman anymore." "No, I am not. I am better, stronger, happier." Delilah leaned against him. "I am exactly who I was meant to be." "As am I." Frank kissed the top of her head. "You know what I want for our anniversary present?" "What is that?" "I want you to read Shakespeare to me before supper every night for the next 30 years. Frank's voice was warm with humor and love. "Think you can manage that?" "I think I can," Delilah said, laughing. "Though at this rate we will have read through the complete works 50 times, and I will enjoy it every single time." Frank turned her in his arms to face him, "Because it is not really about Shakespeare, though I do love the words. It is about sitting together at the end of the day, sharing something beautiful. It is about the sound of your voice and the way you make language sing. It is about us, and the life we have built together." Delilah felt tears prick her eyes. After 3 decades of marriage, he could still move her to emotion with simple sincerity. "I love you, Frank Lawson, more now than I did when we married, and I thought that was the most love a heart could hold." "I love you too, Delilah, my Shakespeare reading, cattle driving mountain woman. You are everything I never knew I needed." They kissed as the sun sank below the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. From inside the house came the sound of children laughing and adults talking, the comfortable noise of family gathered together. This was their legacy, built on love and hard work, on poetry and practicality, on 2 people brave enough to choose each other across every divide that might have separated them. That night, after the party had wound down and the guests had found their beds, Delilah and Frank sat together in their library. The shelves were packed with books now, Shakespeare sharing space with veterinary texts and agricultural manuals and children's stories. The room smelled of leather and paper and the pine logs burning in the fireplace. Delilah opened a volume of sonnets and began to read, her voice still clear and strong despite the years. Frank listened with his eyes closed, a slight smile on his weathered face. When she finished one sonnet, he said, as he always did, "Read me another one." So she read another and another after that, until the fire burned down to embers and the grandfather clock in the hall chimed midnight. Then they climbed the stairs together, hand in hand, to the bedroom where they had slept together for 30 years, where 4 children had been conceived in love and passion, where they had comforted each other through sorrows and celebrated joys. They would have more years together, many of them. Years of watching grandchildren grow, of seeing the ranch thrive under Thomas's management, of taking pride in all their children's accomplishments. Years of morning coffee on the porch and evening Shakespeare readings, of riding together through the valley when the aspens turned gold, of sitting by the fire on winter nights. And through all of it, Frank would ask to hear one more scene, one more sonnet, one more speech before supper, before bed, before tomorrow. And Delilah would always say yes, opening her beloved Shakespeare and letting the words flow over them both like a blessing. Because their love story, which had begun with a woman reading poetry to skeptical cowhands and a man who appreciated truth told pretty, had become its own kind of poetry. It was written not in iambic pentameter, but in shared sunrises and joint endeavors, in children raised and cattle tended, in promises kept and faith honored. It was a love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger, an ever-fixed mark that looked on tempests and was never shaken. The Wild West had been tamed somewhat by the time Frank and Delilah celebrated their 40th anniversary. Georgetown had grown from a rough mining town to a proper small city with paved streets and electric lights. The ranch had indoor plumbing now and telephone lines connecting them to town. But the mountains remained unchanged, eternal and beautiful, and the work of ranching still demanded strength and dedication. Frank was 70 years old, Delilah 62, but both remained active in the ranch operations. Their children had scattered to pursue their own dreams, but they all returned regularly, bringing grandchildren, and now even a few great-grandchildren to run through the house that had held so much love. On the evening of their 40th anniversary, just the two of them this time, Delilah made Frank's favorite meal and they ate on the porch, watching the sun paint the familiar peaks in shades of gold and rose. The air was soft with summer warmth, and somewhere in the distance cattle lowed contentedly. 40 years, Frank said, shaking his head in wonder. When you walked into that ranch yard with your Shakespeare, I never imagined this, all of this. What did you imagine? Delilah asked. I imagined you would last maybe a month before heading back east. I imagined we would hire someone to buy out your share of the ranch. I certainly never imagined that you would become the center of my entire world. Frank reached for her hand across the table. You surprised me in the best possible way. We surprised each other, Delilah said. I came west looking for something I could not even name, and I found everything. Purpose, home, family, love. You gave me all of that. We gave it to each other. Frank stood, pulling her gently to her feet. Now, I believe it is time for our evening reading. What will it be tonight? Delilah smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in the way that always made Frank's heart skip. I thought we might read The Tempest. It seems fitting somehow. Prospero finding peace at the end, reconciling himself to the world as it is. Perfect choice, as always. Frank settled into his favorite chair in the library while Delilah retrieved the book. She read until her voice grew tired, and then Frank took over, reading to her in a voice that had deepened with age but lost none of its warmth. They traded the book back and forth like the old friends and long partners they were, finishing the play as the last light faded from the sky. "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep," Delilah quoted softly when they had finished. "Do you think that is true?" "I think our life has been better than any dream," Frank said. "More real, more textured, more beautiful in its imperfections. Dreams are pale imitations of what we have built together." They sat in comfortable silence for a long while, hands clasped, watching the stars emerge through the library window. This was happiness, Delilah thought, not the passionate intensity of youth, though that had been wonderful in its time. This was the deep satisfaction of a life well lived, of promises kept and love sustained across decades. "Frank," she said eventually. "Yes, my love. Thank you for asking me to read you another one before supper all those years ago. Thank you for seeing past the odd woman reading poetry to cowboys and finding someone worth loving." "I should be thanking you," Frank said, "for being brave enough to come west, to claim your inheritance, to take a chance on a cowhand who quoted Shakespeare back at you. For building this extraordinary life with me." "We are both fortunate then," Delilah said, "fortunate and grateful and still very much in love." "Always," Frank agreed, "until my last breath and beyond." They would have 7 more years together, 7 years of increasing frailty but undiminished devotion. When Frank died peacefully in his sleep at 77, with Delilah's hand in his and a volume of Shakespeare on the bedside table, she grieved deeply, but without regret. They had made the most of every moment, had loved each other fully and well. Delilah lived another decade, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never stopped reading Shakespeare, though now it was mostly to the youngest generation, instilling in them the love of language that had shaped her life. She told them stories of their grandfather, of how he had asked her to read one more scene before supper and changed everything. When she died at 81, quietly on the porch of the house she and Frank had built, a book of Shakespeare's sonnets lay open in her lap. Her family buried her next to Frank on a hilltop overlooking the valley, where the mountains stood eternal and the wind whispered through the pines. The ranch continued under Thomas's management, and then his children's after him, remaining in the family through generations. And in the library of that sturdy log house, on shelves built by Frank Lawson's own hands, the leather-bound volumes of Shakespeare remained, their pages worn soft from decades of reading, a testament to a love story that had begun with poetry and ended only when death demanded separation. But even death could not diminish what they had built together. Their love lived on in the children they had raised, in the land they had stewarded, in the traditions of evening readings and shared appreciation for beauty in all its forms. It lived on in the story that became family legend, told and retold with each generation. How an educated woman from Boston came to the wild Colorado mountains in 1876, how she read Shakespeare to skeptical cowhands, and how one cowboy said, "Read me another one before supper," and found the love of his life. It was a story that proved love could bridge any divide, that passion and practicality could coexist, that romance was not just found in poetry, but could be lived in the daily work of building a life together. It was a story that belonged uniquely to the American West, to a time and place where anything seemed possible for those brave enough to reach for it. And it was a story that ended not with separation, but with completion. 2 lives fully lived, fully shared, rounded not with sleep but with love that endured beyond any ending, eternal as the mountains themselves.